Okay, so that's where I'm going. Those are the issues I want to confront. And we'll be exploring the impact of these demographic transitions and what it does to all kinds of issues that are related to growth performance. It's also going to be connected to a lot of global interactions. So here, again, as I always do, here are the advertisements. Now you have that. Everybody has a handout, I think, with all this stuff on it. But I will point out the stuff that matters and the stuff that doesn't. A large part of what I'm going to be talking to you about when I talk about the impact of demographic factors on capital flows, yes, I mean that. The impact of demographic factors on financial capital flows across borders comes from this paper with Matt Higgins in Population and Development Review, and then a bunch of others that followed, including one that was embedded in the Asian Development Bank volume, Emerging Asia, that came out in, 1997. The first with Matt Higgins and the second with David Bloom. So there is a list of papers that deal with this issue. So, and other people are doing it too. I'm just, of course, advertising my own work. So it's not, what I'm going to talk to you today is not some speculation on my part. It's been well developed in terms of the analytics and well developed in terms of the analytics in history and in the more recent episodes. What we fight over is how big the impacts are, not whether they're significant. So it's focusing on accumulation and factor flows and all that stuff. So as I go along in the lecture, you can tick off these papers as they relate to the issues that I'm discussing, and you can decide whether or not you want to pursue them or not. And you'll have the references. Okay, so let me talk about the demographic transition. Most of you in the room know what it's all about, but maybe some of you don't. So let's be sure we're on the same level playing field, and I'll go through it kind of quickly. So it describes basically the transition, long time period for the transition, some longer than others, some shorter than others, as we'll see, but takes you from a pre-industrial relationship in families that are very high fertility and very high mortality. The survival rates in kids are low. Parents have a lot of kids to ensure enough survivors for whatever they're after, like retirement and all the rest. How you get from that system, which is pre-industrial, agrarian, poor system, to a modern system of low fertility, low mortality, fewer kids, but higher quality kids, investing lots of resources in the quality of children rather than a lot of children. So it's going from one of those positions to the next. That's the demographic transition we're talking about. It takes a long time to pull it off, and the reason it takes a long time is that it takes a long time to persuade parents that changes in the mortality rates of their kids is a permanent event. And they're very slow to adjust to the changing infant mortality environment, and as long as they're slow to adjust, they're going to have a lot more kids than they wanted. And it may take generations to change behavior. Okay, so it takes a while to pull off. It took Europe, and the countries in Europe, about a century to undergo their demographic transition, and it was, in any case, less dramatic than it's been in Asia since World War II and elsewhere, Latin America and Africa. Took what, about a half century, maybe only 4 decades in East Asia. and Africa somewhere in between those two limits. And here I'm going to give you a stylized version of the demographic transition. And like other stylized versions, it omits a lot of other events that can twist and turn things, and some country-specific events. But here's what it looks like in terms of the simplest characterization. You start off high fertility, high mortality. The top line is fertility. It's above the mortality, otherwise you wouldn't have any population growth. But you notice in the middle, you get this, the gap between the rate, the fertility rate and mortality rate is at its maximum. It's the child, it's total fertility rate. And that arrow points out the max. And it could be, in some societies, that top fertility line isn't flat, but rather in early stages actually shows an improvement. As economic conditions improve, families might decide, let's have more kids, because they want more kids to survive, because they're richer and can support more survivors. But they didn't count on the fact that the kids are going to, more kids will survive, so they get more kids than they wanted by a lot. But I've ignored that little blip that often takes place, an upward blip in fertility. The problem, of course, is the decline in fertility lags far behind the decline in infant mortality, for the reasons I gave. It just takes parents a long time to adjust to the change in disease environment and the survival rate of the kids. So that's why you get this big discrepancy between the two. So this first, under that blue arrow down the lower panel, gives you a plot of what population growth rates will look like. They start off, they accelerate, and they reach a peak in early development, and then they start on the downside as the demographic transition plays itself out. So all the literature in the 1950s and 60s in that part is a lot of doom and gloom and Malthusian stories. Not too much before Alan Kelly is writing his 1988 survey article. But then the population growth rates in specific countries begin to tail off, and you hear less conversation about it. But note this result. The other skinnier line plots what's happening to the age distribution, the percentage of the population that are young adult or the percentage of the population that are working age. And you'll note that at the start, the percentage of the population working age drops. The dependency rate rises. And it'll do so significantly if you get a big infant mortality rate. Bang. And that's exactly what happened in the 40s. You got, in the early 50s, big decline in infant mortality rates. And the initial impact, increasing child survival rates, is to increase the dependency rate, or the opposite, to reduce the share of the population that are younger, the share of the adult working age population. But then it turns around. Remember that pig going through the boa constrictor. As those kids age 15, 20 years, they become young adults and start participating in the labor market. And you get this turnaround and you get a rise. And those numbers will soar as more and more of these children enter the productive adult age range. And it isn't yet time for those babies to get old enough to be in retirement and elderly phases. So it rises to this peak, and then as you begin to have those individuals reach retirement and the elderly ages, then the participation rate drops off. And then flattens out and reaches a steady state. So there's the transition that really matters, where this red arrow is pointing. And note it has much bigger variance to it than just the population growth rate. given the dynamics of the demography. So that's the event we're looking at, and we want to know how that skinny line in the second panel has an impact on economic variables of all kinds. So that's what I'm after. Note that if parents adjusted immediately to the change in disease environment and infant mortality rates, they say, aha, we see what's happening. Let's forestall some new births because now we know they're going to survive. Then there wouldn't be any problem to discuss. The fertility rate would adjust immediately to the infant mortality rate, and you wouldn't have any demographic transition to talk about. But that's not the way the world is, as I've urged upon you. That is, parents are slow to adjust. It's also true if the state intervenes, if government intervenes and imposes a rule that is obeyed and policed, and the rule is you can only have 2 or 3 kids, then it may also be true that fertility would adjust immediately to the change in infant mortality. That is, benign authorities know more about the change in the disease environment and what it does to infant mortality, and therefore immediately impose a restriction. You can only have 2 or 3 kids, that's it. Then the fertility will decline, imposed on them. Well, you don't see that happening too much out there. But you do see some cases, like under Chairman Mao, if you go extreme and you're panicked by population growth rates and you have one-child policies, then you won't get these demographic transition effects. But instead what you'll get is what China will have over the next 50 years. Very sharp retardation in growth performance. So think twice before tying the Philippine economy to Chinese performance. Tie it to India. That's a better bet. Because the one-child policy is going to drag down growth rates in China for sure in the future. Whereas Singapore's one-child policy, I only learned this weekend. I didn't know they had one-child policy. They did. It's two-child? Are you sure? Excuse me, I'm corrected by my wife. It's a two-child policy. But it doesn't matter for Singapore because all they have to do is open and shut the tap on immigration to fill any blanks they have. Whereas countries the size of China, that's unlikely to be quite as effective an option. In any case, but state policies can matter. Whether or not the state allows a demographic transition to obey the laws of motion you just saw in that diagram will matter. The economics will be the same. It's only that the state tends to pervert it. So figure 1 establishes 3 points I want you to take away. One is the demographic shock has to be specifically focused on one age group. And the one we were looking at, a demographic transition, is kids. Perhaps you didn't know that across the 20th century, where the economic distance, per capita income distance, between poor and rich countries has widened, so there's been what we economists call divergence.